for myself, being the Minister of Justice, to create that space was something that I believed fundamentally in and worked incredibly hard towards. There were differences of opinion about how that work should unfold.
Tonight, Jody Wilson-Raybould tells us more about her time as Canada's first Indigenous Attorney General. Good evening. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Per-child spending in this country shows that First Nations children have been shortchanged for years, whether they went through an underfunded, on-reserve child welfare agency or were previously denied medical treatment, now routinely given under Jordan's principle. As Todd Lamoran reports, the Human Rights Tribunal is hearing arguments that these children deserve compensation, but lawyers for the Canadian government disagree.
Canada lawyer Robert Frater admits to past wrongdoing, but argued they have fixed the system.
We don't deny that this tribunal found that Canada's underfunding was discriminatory. We simply say that a complaint can't allege one sort of discrimination and then seek a remedy for a different one.
The remedy the Human Rights Tribunal is to consider is compensating tens of thousands of children. A conservative dollar amount would be more than $2 billion. Frater argued the original complaint was about the system itself, not individuals in it. The Assembly of First Nations lawyer said otherwise.
The benefits flow directly to the First Nation communities themselves and also their citizens. So we would suggest that compensation in this case can flow through that process and is appropriate that the tribunal make an order of compensation to deal with this issue.
Frater also argued that this isn't a class action suit, and individuals have not given testimony as evidence. The First Nations Caring Society lawyer responded to that.
We are not talking about adults. We're talking about bringing children into this room and putting them under cross-examination to attest to the harms that they have experienced. When we can use our common sense as adults and as human beings to understand what that harm is without having to put those children through a traumatizing event.
Caring Society Executive Director Cindy Blackstock called denying compensation a disturbing act by Canada.
That to me is a very sad day for reconciliation, for the Prime Minister's commitment to implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. And it's a sad day for society if their arguments are allowed to survive.
The tribunal members are reserving judgment on compensation. It next meets in May to examine the issue of jurisdiction. Todd Lamoran, APTN National News, Ottawa.
APTN sat down with Jody Wilson-Raybould, the former Liberal Attorney General, now independent MLA, who is at the center of a major Liberal government scandal. We have that interview coming up after the break, but first here's tomorrow's weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, we've got 11 in rain in Fredericton, 14 in rain in Halifax. Sunny and 8 in Happy Valley Goose Bay, 6 in Nain and Cartwright. St. Jovite is 2 with some rain, and rain also in Montreal at 6 degrees. Sarnia is 10 and sunny, Windsor's 11 and sunshine. Cloudy and rain in Sioux Lookout, 2 and sunshine in Big Trout Lake. 3 and rain in Thompson, 5 and sunshine in God's Lake and Norway House. 10 and sunshine for Gimli, 11 and sunny in Winnipeg. 10 and rain in Swift Current, 11 with a mix of sun and cloud in Estevan. 6 with a mix of sun and cloud in Meadow Lake, 2 and sunshine in Stony Rapids. Welcome back. Following her speech at the BC First Nations Provincial Justice Forum Wednesday, Jody Wilson-Raybould sat down with APTN News to talk about her efforts to strengthen Indigenous rights during her time as Justice Minister and Attorney General in the Trudeau government. We aired part 1 of that interview yesterday, which you can watch on our website, aptnnews.ca. And now here is Justin Brake with part 2.
When we go back to 2017, you were appointed chair of the new working group of ministers to review laws and policies related to Indigenous peoples. In August of 2018, a new reconciliation committee was created to continue that committee's work, but you were no longer the lead. Why do you think you were taken out of that leadership role?
Well, you'd probably have to ask somebody else that question, perhaps the Prime Minister that question. What I can say is that as Minister, I was entirely committed to doing the work that I knew needed to be done based on generations of advocacy by Indigenous peoples across the country to, again, ensure that the space is created for the full box of rights that exist in Section 35 of our Constitution, and that Indigenous peoples, and for myself, being the Minister of Justice, to create that space was something that I believed fundamentally in and worked incredibly hard towards. There were differences of opinion about how that work should unfold. I can say that I was disappointed based on the expertise that I was able to accumulate over the course of my life and learn from Indigenous leaders when I was in elected roles as an Indigenous, as the regional chief, for example, that that expertise or that knowledge and that understanding of what it means to be Indigenous, what it means to live in an Indigenous community, and what it meant, for example, for my community to, in certain ways, move out from under the Indian Act and to improve our quality of life, whether it be around the fiscal relationship or whether it be around land and resource issues. We were able to do that, and the success and the empowerment that happened within my own community as a result is incredibly important. And I don't believe that Indigenous peoples, in order to be self-determining or in order to move beyond the Indian Act, should necessarily have to go to court to render the Indian Act ultra vires, or that it doesn't apply, or to negotiate in what I like to call interminable negotiations. I believe, and dating back to when I was the regional chief and before, that there should be a mechanism in this country to enable a community and a nation when they're ready, willing, and able, because there is a fiduciary obligation and relationship between Indigenous communities and the Crown to move away from that relationship and to determine for themselves how they're going to govern.
And so coming into the role as Minister of Justice and Attorney General and taking the lead at first in helping develop this rights framework, there was pushback from the Assembly of First Nations, which you were a member of, a leader within that organization just a few years ago. They wanted a First Nations-led process, and they rejected the 10 principles respecting the Government of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples, saying that it was unilaterally developed, not with First Nations. Were you surprised by that reaction?
I don't know if surprised is the right word. I mean, I have great respect for the work that Indigenous leaders do, including Indigenous leaders and former colleagues of mine, and continued friends that still are elected leaders in the Assembly of First Nations. My regional chief, Terry Teegee, is here in British Columbia. I do not expect change to come easily. People, including Indigenous peoples, are concerned when we move away from the status quo. The 10 principles, and I'm incredibly proud, still are on the books as principles that the Government of Canada is following in terms of its relationship with Indigenous peoples. Were developed not unilaterally. Those principles were developed during my time as regional chief, and that's not just within British Columbia, but working with other Indigenous communities across the country. But benefiting from the time that I was regional chief, the chiefs of this province did come together and at the time developed 4 principles around the relationship between and among Indigenous peoples and other orders of government to guide the relationship and how it should be built. I benefited from that and brought that work to my role as the Minister of Justice and continued to move forward with that work. I mean, I understand the need to ensure that governments fulfill their obligations in terms of consultation with Indigenous communities on issues that affect Indigenous communities directly. Of course, that's an obligation. It's a legal obligation that governments have to comply with. And we've seen evidence of governments not complying with that. But in terms of the principles, in terms of rights recognition, it's just that. It's recognizing Indigenous people's rights. The principles speak about having an economic component to rights. They speak about the necessity of having the honor of the Crown engaged in all interactions that the federal government participates in. Talks about self-government, talks about self-determination. These are principles that are rooted in documents like the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and are rooted in efforts that Indigenous communities, self-governing communities across the country have upheld as being necessary for the transformation of Indigenous communities. And I will say, too, that they're also rooted in the really important minimum standards, the articles in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Now, the AFN and others are expressing concerns similar to the ones that they have with the rights framework on how the government is now proceeding with policy reviews, comprehensive claims, specific claims, addition to reserve lands, and the inherent right policy. You said at the Justice Forum that you were concerned that government has fallen back into old patterns of fearing the recognition of Indigenous rights and what that would mean for Canada as opposed to looking at the rights as they already exist. How can the Crown proceed on these key policies in light of that fear that you talk about?
Well, I hope that the Crown, or the federal government in this case, in reviewing the so-called comprehensive claims policies, specific claims, the inherent right policy, will listen to Indigenous peoples, will listen to a collective of self-governing Indigenous communities that have transformed their nations based on actually having control or decision-making authority over what they do and what they don't do. So, one, I would hope that the Government of Canada would continue to engage and listen to Indigenous communities about how those policies should be changed. But I will say, in terms of looking to change those fundamental or core policies at this point, in absence of legislation or a change in the law that moves from denial of rights to the recognition of rights, it is difficult for me to see how those policies are going to be long-lasting. The idea of a rights recognition and implementation framework that was rooted in legislatively was to ensure that the space is created for the recognition of rights, and that recognition of rights would live beyond the life of one government. That was the intent. That is how the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the federal government will be transformed. So I hope that the review of those policies will go well. It will go well if Indigenous communities that have experienced those policies in positive and negative ways are listened to, their experience is listened to, the decades of advocacy that they have been putting forward around changing those policies needs to be heard. And it's not something that can happen overnight, so I'm a bit concerned about the time that's left between now and the election. The only way that I see a transformation in the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown is if we all, no matter what party we come from or where we sit on the political spectrum, invest the necessary time and energy to change the status quo and move to a reality where rights recognition are first and foremost, and people, nations come to the table, governments come to the table on an equal footing. And I ended my speech today on that. That's how I envision Indigenous peoples rebuilding in an incredibly positive way, building on the success that they've had already, improving the quality of life for their people, but in turn, improving the quality of life for all Canadians to answer the unfinished business, the unfinished question of Confederation, which is to ensure that Indigenous peoples find their rightful place in this country, something that has been long overdue.
One final question for you. You attended Elizabeth May's wedding over the weekend, and you've said that you've talked with the Greens and the NDP potentially running for another party in the coming election. Where are you in these considerations?
Well, That's a big question these days, and I completely respect people for asking that question. I'm still considering my options, and as you say, I have had the opportunity to speak to some of the leaders, including Elizabeth May, and her wedding was incredibly beautiful, by the way. She's a friend, so we didn't talk politics at her wedding. But I'll continue to have conversations with her and with others as I figure out what's right for me in terms of politics and my next steps. Core to that is ensuring that I continue as much as I can to be here in Vancouver Granville, my riding, to talk to my constituents and to hear what they have to say, listen to any advice that they have for me. But I do feel that my time in federal politics has not ended. I feel that I still have important things to contribute, and I feel that my voice is important to making sound public policy in this country. And I've never been a member of a political party before I joined the Liberal Party of Canada when I was asked to run by the then leader, now Prime Minister. And I didn't take that decision lightly. I will say, though, that I'm not partisan in the truest political sense. I think that there's incredibly important issues facing our country, including issues around the reconciliation of with Indigenous peoples, around the environment, around climate change, issues that need to be addressed in as much as we can a nonpartisan way, because they're too important to be compartmentalized. So that's the kind of politics that I believe in. I actually fundamentally believe in doing politics differently. So where that lands me, leading up to the election in October, I'm going to consider it very seriously, as I do everything. But I, again, believe that I still have a voice, and that voice, the voices of Indigenous peoples, people from different walks of life, different socioeconomic classes, is important to be at the table, is important to be sitting in the House of Commons. So I hope that the election brings an incredible amount of diversity to it by way of candidates, and I'll let you know if I will be among them.
Okay, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Fascinating to finally hear from her. If you missed the first part, which aired yesterday, you can watch it at aptnnews.ca. Time for us to take another quick break, but stick around. We've got more news to come, and here's the rest of tomorrow's weather. To northern Alberta, we've got Peace River with a mix of sun and cloud, and 8 degrees, 5 in sunshine in Fort McMurray, 1 and snow in Edmonton, 10 and rain in Lethbridge, 11 in sunshine in Tofino, 14 and sunny in Victoria, 5 and rain in Fort Nelson, 7 and rain in Prince George. Dawson City's sunny and 9 degrees, 8 and sunshine in Whitehorse. Wrigley is in at 6 with sunny skies, -3 and sunshine in Wati. Tuck is in at -9 with clear skies, -6 and clear in Colville Lake. -15 with a mix of sun and cloud in Cambridge Bay, -12 and sunshine in Whale Cove. -17 and sunny in Arctic Bay, 0 and a mix of sun and cloud in Iqaluit. Welcome back. A mother in northwestern Ontario is looking for answers after her daughter was arrested on Tuesday. In a video that was widely shared on social media, an officer can be seen tackling the teenager to the ground. She was later charged for assaulting a police officer. The woman who recorded the incident says her family is traumatized by what they saw. And while they're looking for answers, the police aren't saying much about the incident. Willa Fiddler has this.
We just threw him down.
Oh,
face first into the cement.
oh my God.
This video was posted to Facebook on Tuesday evening by witnesses who happened to be driving by when they turned around and caught this on camera. Debbie Wilson-Raybould said she was driving around Lost in Sulicote with her 2 daughters when she saw an officer and what looked like a young boy crying, so she stopped and rolled down the window.
And the cop asked, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Well, we're just stopping because it looks like he's in distress."
Wilson-Raybould says they kept going but turned around out of concern. That's when her daughters started recording and more police show up.
Well, There's 3 more cops coming to help him. He's just a little boy. 2 more.
The little boy turned out to be a 16-year-old girl who police have now charged with 3 counts of assault. In a media release, police say the youth was highly intoxicated. The youth's mother, who arrives at the end of the video, told APTN she had asked the police to help her daughter sober up. She says it broke her heart to see her daughter being slammed to the ground when she later saw the video. Wilson-Raybould says her family is traumatized by the experience and concerned by the questions from the arresting officer. In the video, the officer tells Wilson-Raybould a mental health nurse had just arrived on scene, but she said that should have happened sooner.
Where were the youth? Where's the youth person is what I want to know. Where was this mental health lady? Where was somebody? Where was a female? Like, where was that mental health worker? Because when she was sitting on the bench crying, I'm pretty sure that, somebody could have been there then.
Okay, can I have your names, please?
I feel like I don't have to give you my name.
Well, you're driving a motor vehicle right now, so you need a license to drive a vehicle.
Am I being stopped for something?
Well, I'm asking you for your names right now, because you just witnessed her spit and kick at me.
Well,
did you not?
No, I did not. I just saw you throw her down. When we came around, that's all I witnessed was you throwing her down. That was the first thing I saw.
So, me being a police officer here to help people, I'm just wondering why you guys are recording me.
I think it's our right to record, just to make sure that everything, I'm pretty sure, as the public, we have a right to record just to make sure.
Okay, well, I would appreciate it as also the public that when I'm in distress and I'm getting assaulted, that somebody help me too, right?
That's an interesting perspective.
Because being a police officer doesn't afford her the right to assault me, right? Her mom is the one that called her in today. She flagged me down saying that she was intoxicated and that she's actually on conditions not to drink. Her mom was not able to care for her tonight, so I was giving her a safe place to stay. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay. You guys have a nice day, okay?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, his comments seemed seemingly ridiculous only because, okay, you have the gun, you have handcuffs, you're twice or 3 times bigger than this person. You don't want me to help that person, but you would like me to, tackle this 95-pound person for you? You lost control.
Wilson-Raybould said she's reached out to the OPP's Indigenous Bureau in Aurelia about the incident and will reach out to community services for support. The young girl was released from custody and taken to hospital by her mother. Willow Fiddler, APTN National News, Thunder Bay.
That's your news for this Friday. If you missed anything this week, you can catch up on our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Have a great night, and I'll see you back here tomorrow with your APTN News Weekend.